Welcome, people. We're getting started here, and we're just gonna give a about a minute to let people get in from the waiting room. Um, I'm Josh Kroll, and I will be doing this webinar today. Um, so just gonna wait till that participant list stops adding numbers. Um, okay, I think we're there. Oh, one more. Um, so. I'm going to get started. Try and respect your time. So I'm Josh Kroll. I'm with Families Rising. I've been with Families Rising, or formerly known as NACAC, North American Council on Adoptable Children, for just over 27 years. And I've either been supporting or running the Adoption Subsidy Resource Center here. Um, at Families Rising in all that time. I'm also the tax credit guy too. So if anybody has federal adoption tax credits, reach out to me about that. Um, I want to make real clear before we start getting into this. This session is about um, advocating for system change or advocating to improve adoption assistance. I see Shar from Minnesota is on here. Hi. Someone I've worked with many times, our worker helping families. And like an example in Minnesota is trying to eliminate something called the alternate rate. That's something that we're working on. This isn't about your specific cases or questions. You're more than welcome to stay on and listen to this whole thing. But if you're really wanting just one-on-one help with questions, you can also, I put into the chat my email and my phone number, and we can follow up there. If you don't, if you have other things pressing, this session is also being recorded if you do need to step away. So, that's a little bit about me. And we're talking, like I said, we're talking about advocating for adoption assistance programs. And this is for folks in the US and Canada. I didn't see any registrants from Canada, but I will cover some of that just in case someone checks it out later. Um, so a little bit about our organization. If you're not too familiar with us, our mission is to amplify those with lived experience, assist adoptive, foster, and kinship parents, educate child welfare professionals, and champion the well-being of children and families. And one great way to help support children and families is make sure they have adequate resources and support, so they have the best chance of maturing into a to productive adult if that's a possibility. Um, at Families Rising, we support adoptive, foster, and kinship parents and young people. We educate child welfare professionals and advocate that children and families have support. So today, particularly because there's a lot of changes, a lot of uncertainty within the US federal government. I'm going to actually do a little bit on the federal impact in the US. Then I'm going to go into my normal sort of talks here about legislative engagement, talking points and telling stories, research, some other advocacy tools that are out there, some specific advocacy ideas, and two state examples. To just give you an example of how things have sort of worked over time. It can be a long grind, but I think it's really, it's important, and being at the table is important. So, um, and if folks want to throw in what state or province that they're with, or anything else they want to share or questions they might have, so I can see if it's something I should make sure to address, feel free to put that in the chat. That way I can, maybe highlight some of the things in your particular state that I could see some improvement on, or province. So I want to cover the first thing, misperceptions. A lot of times, people who aren't in the child welfare system think about families who are fostering, who are adopting, especially if they learn about adoption assistance or guardianship. They're talking about, sometimes they think that the parents are in it for the money. And that's not really the case. I mean, there might be some out there, but the reality is a lot of times the amount of support that's available through adoption assistance doesn't cover even the ordinary needs in many states, let alone the extraordinary needs. Sometimes people will say things like, we don't pay parents to raise their own children or birth children, or birth children. But like those children haven't been removed by the system. A lot of these children have faced significant trauma, and they need extra resources to help support them. I mean, like the big thing that um, um, I think about this is when the state has legally taken on the children into their care for adoption or for foster care, and then they place the children, they get adopted by someone, it's kind of like adoption assistance is like child support, because the state had legal responsibility at some point, and it's kind of like they recognize that the folks actually raising the children need some assistance to do that. Um, so just want to sort of cover that there. Um, so I'm going to flip over to the federal impacts in the US. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. Um, so at the end of January, there was an OMB budget memo that went out that was talking about it was going to look at all these things with DEI and possibly stop funding for them. In that long list did include the Title IV-E programs of foster care, adoption assistance, and guardianship assistance. Title IV-E is the part of the Social Security Act that provides funding from the federal government to the states to reimburse them for a portion of the money that they're paying as that they're paying in these programs for children who are eligible. Currently, all children adopted from the foster care system, unless there's been a administrative hurdle, should be Title IV eligible as of July 1st of last year. Foster care and guardianship assistance have slightly different rules, and those they don't all match. So not all children with guardianship assistance nor children in foster care qualify for Title IV funding. But when they do, they get reimbursed here on the fourth or third bullet point. They get reimbursed under what's called the FMAP. It's the Federal Medical Assistance Program. I'm not sure what the FMAP is. I just always look for FMAP. But it's the federal government reimburses states from 50 to 73%. Some of the territories can be in the 80s. But the states are never less than 50%. So like Minnesota, where I'm located, is reimbursed 50%. But that means that the state and or counties throughout the US, depending on how your state is structures the non-federal share, are picking up the rest of that. So anywhere between 50 to 27% is still coming not from the feds. There was also talks, and I don't know if I didn't look for it in the budget, if Medicaid was in there, but there's been a lot of talks about, or not Medicare, Medicaid. There's been a lot of talks about potential cuts or changes to Medicaid. One big concern, obviously, any just straight cut is a big concern, but another concern is they might block grant it. Block granting something where they say they come up with a formulary and say this is how much your state's gonna get, and then your state has to try and provide all the services with that budget and make up with that whatever else with state dollars. Um, that's challenging. I mean, the other big concern could be maybe they keep Medicaid, but they change the FMAP, and I believe that would then impact the reimbursement rates for the 4E programs as well as for the Medicaid. These sorts of changes may really impact state budgets and make it a lot harder to make improvements, because improvements cost money usually, depending what they are. But It also may mean that you're on the defense to try and prevent changes that are less support through the adoption assistance program. So this is going to have a big impact depending on what happens. I personally think I'm like a policy amateur. I have done some Hill visits in Congress. I've done some visits in Minnesota with Minnesota state legislatures, and I've testified twice. And I wish I could have a week ago. There was a bill related to adoption assistance I wanted to, but I was in Puerto Rico, which is also why this got rescheduled. So thank you all for showing up based on our reschedule. So, and unfortunately, Puerto Rico's not and the place I was staying didn't have really reliable Wi-Fi, so it was the right choice to to reschedule this. So I think that contacting your 2 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. representative to share stories about how these programs are benefits to your family, or if you're workers or administrators, the families you serve, and how they meet the need of your child. We will cover telling stories later on, so that will be useful. Um, Timing wise, I think it's really important to start reaching out to members of Congress right now because they're already working on what's called budget reconciliation, and they're working on this is like stuff that actual lobbyists understand a lot better, but they're working on a top line number for different um, parts of the federal government. So like Health and Human Services is going to have a top budget number, and then there are going to be negotiations within that of what gets funded. Um, and the reality is like Title IV programs are not small, but they're not that big of a program, but sharing information about it now might help protect them before they craft their final bill because you don't want to like find out, oh, this is what they're doing. Like you can complain once you know what they're going to do, because that's useful too. But it's better for you to educate prior to, so that they know the value of these programs, and you might not have to play defense when the final bill comes out because you got it protected before they actually drafted the bill. Folks who are interested in up to doing that, house.gov or senate.gov are how you find your senators and your House members. If your senator or House member are Republicans, um, extra important to reach out to them because reconciliation means that they don't need Democratic votes. So they're the ones that are going to be completely shaping the budget. And the same thing happens at times when the Democrats have full control. It's not a judgment call on it. It's just the reality of who's in charge. Um, you can call the DC office. If you go to their website, they often have the local offices too. You might have a better chance getting your voice heard by calling the local office. Calls are better than emails. Um, so I'm just throwing that out there because I think this is going to impact everything that people are going to be able to do. And I'm sure state legislatures are probably going to be fiscally conservative this budget cycle with the uncertainty coming from Congress. So, and from the federal government. So now we got that all out of the way. Let's talk about the main points I like to talk about. So I personally think that the state and provincial legislatures are the most important things that people should target because they hold the purse strings. In the US, the federal government partially pays it too, but the state has to match for that, has to put in some money to get that reimbursement. Like for adoption assistance rates, um, we're going to go with Minnesota. If Minnesota gives me an adoption subsidy of $1,000, they're going to get reimbursed 500. If they give me a subsidy of 200 or $2,000, they get reimbursed 1,000. It's just a straight percentage, but the state has to invest their portion, their share, or the counties to um, to be able to get that federal matching. It's kind of like if you think about it, like people who have like 401ks, like if you put in this much, your employer might match it. It's the same sort of thing. The states are investing in their children and families and getting reimbursement from the federal government. But if the state is in a budget crisis, or the state, um, for whatever reason doesn't value this, they're the ones that control particularly rates. Um, because they have to fund that part of it. And in some states, like I didn't see anybody from Ohio, but Ohio, they have really weird things with very heavy burdens on the counties, and it makes things very challenging in that state. Um, and so there you might actually be dealing with county commissioners, not just state legislators or governors. Many things are set in statute, laws that are passed by the state. Not every state or province, but a lot of times, um, the definition of special needs may be very explicit in state law. Sometimes it's just like you get to define it and then it's done in a different like rulemaking process. But that can be a place where you want to change it. Here in Minnesota, it is in Minnesota statute. But I know like in Georgia, when they've looked at changing their definition of special needs, who's eligible for adoption subsidy, they've done it through a rulemaking process, and we've provided comments on those rules, suggestions in the past. Um, every legislature, I think in provincial ones, there's two. In the US, I know every state has two chambers except for Nebraska that has one chamber. So you might be working, often they're called House and Senate, but they could be Assembly, they can be other names, but there's usually going to be two chambers in the US. I think the Canadian provinces, all except for Nebraska. Um, and generally, there are going to be members of committees. They're going to be committees that deal with specific issues. It can be called human service, child and family, whatever it is, but those are really important ones because that's usually where hearings are going to go through. So finding out who's members of those, and especially if you're one of their constituents, is always really useful. Um, in Canada, they have parliaments, and the legislator it's really interesting, is a minister over that department. So like here in the US, usually there's going to be like a commissioner or secretary or something that's over like human services. Let's say Department of Human Services. There's going to be some top person, but they're usually appointed by the governor. In Canada, it's actually one of the members of parliament, or provincial parliament, or whatever it's called, is actually elevated to be the head over the executive branch of an area that they like. So they're both a legislator as well as the head of the executive. So if anybody is listening to this dealing with Canada, who is your minister? We had a board member in Ontario, and her um, um, MPP was the minister over children and families development. No, that's BC. Well, whatever their uh, children youth development maybe. That was a good person to connect with, and it was great to have one of our board members be a direct constituent of the minister over that department. Understanding the legislature, most states pass 2-year budget cycles during the odd number years. So that would be this year, 2025. When is the legislature in session? Almost all of them are in right now. The National Council Conference on State Legislatures is an excellent resource, just in general, in understanding legislatures. They're a nonpartisan organization that serves state legislators. That's their job. They sometimes ask me questions about adoption subsidy, but they do a lot of work with legislators and research. They're a great organization. Um, and I don't know how this got to from the other side, but or well, I guess let's go to this side. But in the part I was talking about committees, if you really want to be engaged, although you get a lot of emails, at least if Minnesota's a basis, see if they have email lists about what's going on. You can see if sometimes it's really clear from the bill list, like, oh, I don't need to pay attention to that because it's dealing with like ambulances, reimbursement rates. Like, yeah, that's not child welfare. I'm not paying attention. When I've looked at it in the past, provincial calendars seem to be spring and fall. Um, and there's all sorts of weird arcane things. Sometimes things have to be heard a certain number of times within a certain time of the legislative process. If they're not, they might get rolled into a big bill, and there's usually arguments about those, but they're called omnibus bills. Sorry, um, and those can be really contentious because there's like things that people want and other things they don't want, and it's sort of like the big compromise bill. Although not always compromise if you know if your state has a trifecta where both houses and the governor are all held by the same party. Sometimes those are put through, but even then, when you're talking to people, there are times you'll lose people from the same party because they disagree on something, and you can pick up someone from another party, but it's harder on those bigger bills. Connecting with your legislators, I think, is really important. I've often met with my legislators. I actually met both of them last month. There was a really great organization, Minnesota Social Service Association, was doing a visits, and I was able to go with it. And so they lined up meetings with my state rep and my state senator, who I had not met before. So the first thing is, who are they? Are there any personal details about your legislature? Like, I learned that one, I think, had worked in chemical dependency work or mental health, but both were very engaged on child welfare or on human service information. In the past, when I first moved into my house, um, the legislator, my state rep, was actually someone I went to high school with. I didn't know her, but we were able to talk, and we talked about some of the issues with our at the time much lower adoption subsidy rates. And she had shared that her godparents were foster parents, and they struggled with the reduction in support moving from foster to adopt, about moving forward with adoption. So she really got it because she had that personal connection. There are some, like one of the bills to make our subsidy program better here in Minnesota right now is being introduced by Representative Hicks out of Rochester, and she, I believe, is an adoptive parent herself. Um, but some people, even if they're not, they might have a personal connection. There used to be a senator in Minnesota who's had adopted siblings. Um, so there's a lot of ways you can um, sort of find out their level of engagement or interest in this issue. And the other thing is, if you find someone that's like this, like I'm in Minneapolis, I'm over an hour from Rochester, but that's someone who we could go to, Representative Hicks, because they are very engaged on this issue, because they know it personally. So even if I'm not the direct constituent, that doesn't mean I can't talk with them. I can't try and help them, share stories with them, because ultimately you're going to need someone to introduce a bill. You need an author, and they don't necessarily have to be your direct legislator. Um, you, when dealing with legislatures, there can be compromises because some things take time, especially if things that have a big cost involved with it. If it's not a big cost, it might be pretty easy if you can get it to the table. Um, but you know, building um, community, building relationships is really helpful because it might take multiple sessions. Um, One of the things that I've definitely seen, this is probably about 15 years ago, but I saw both in California and Washington State that there were um, findings, information coming from the legislature where they are worried about the growing cost of the adoption assistance program. Because some kids in foster care get reunified, right? A lot of kids get reunified. Not every child who enters foster care is going to get adopted or moved to guardianship assistance. So sometimes what will happen is they'll see this line item on their budget, like foster care caseloads are relatively steady, but the adoption assistance budget keeps blowing up. But that's good because families are getting permanency, but that might make them try and cut back on the benefits or make it a little harder. And I'll cover in the two-state example, I'll cover Washington. Um, I already said it'll take multiple years. Don't wait until your state or province has a surplus to begin laying the groundwork. Because I'm going to tell you, I'm very amateur policy. Like I go and talk with people who do, are very involved all the time, do a lot more lobbying or advocacy, and really are at the state capitol or at the federal thing. And they're talking all the time with people. They're developing those relationships. They're ready to push their plan, what their need, the moment there's extra money available. If you're like, oh, well, hey, we should do this, they're like, who are you? Why did you show up? What? Well, this, we're already signing into this because we've been trying to get this funded for years. So you need to be ready to get out there, work on those relationships. And it's hard because, people retire, they leave, whatever, but, you just have to keep at it. Um, if you have not already met or talked with your legislator, some great ways to connect with them are maybe it's going to be hard right now because it's, they're going to be super busy, but um, you could invite your legislator to come to an open house with other parents, resource families. Find out when they have meetings with the constituents in the district and attend it. My previous senator and the two reps in the Senate district here in Minnesota used to have a regular meeting just like 6 blocks away. I'd walk over and spend my Saturday morning listening to what they had to report and share what I wanted them to focus on. Calling is better than a letter or an email. I mean, and I also always tell them my address, so they know I'm constituents of theirs. When I did the session uh, last month and met with a state rep and state senator, I was with three other people from another organization, and we all, because we're all Minneapolis people, we all gave our neighborhoods and said that's where we live. So that was really, it's kind of nice. It made it feel a little more intimate than, like being in Washington, D.C. So, um, but the point here of letting them know where you are is like I can reach out and tell people things, and I have been, with groups meeting with members of Congress where I'm not from their district, but other people in the group are. But I can share my information, what we talk about. But really, it's the constituent they're focused on, because you can vote for them or not vote for them. So, um, if a group that advocates for child welfare issues do engage the legislature, like the MSSA I was talking about, go to that. I did that. They scheduled meetings nicely in advance with the legislator. Um, I it's a lot first, always schedule the meetings in advance if it's during session. And you might not be able to. We were denied, or we weren't able to schedule one, and then they were able to schedule one that afternoon, and we had 15 minutes to meet. That was it. But if the group is scheduling meetings, even better. But they may also want to highlight their issues that may not be your exact top issue. I was still able to talk about mine, even though it wasn't the main issue that everybody else was talking about. If your county has an adoption day, invite them to it. They might not go, but it's a great way to show how children in the foster care system are getting forever families. There's a lot of times the media covers like the horror stories and sensationalizes things related to foster adopt children. But let's show them the good things. Like, look at all these happy families. Look at these kids getting permanency. Um, be creative. I'm just giving you some ideas, but they should be responsive to your issues. Um, so be creative. Um, I still think as a constituent, you're their boss, but that doesn't mean they're going to be um, super great. I had a really great state senator, really engaged on the issues. He didn't agree with the solution that our organization wanted versus a different organization, and often would be sort of dismissive. But He ultimately voted for what I wanted him to, but I didn't take it personally, even though at times it was a little hard, because I knew he was very engaged in child welfare issues, and he did have, the best interest in heart. Um, the way districts are drawn, there may be non-responsive legislators. They might not be interested in the issue. They might just blow you off. Um, I really can't do anything about that. I live in a district that's like 80% Democratic. I'm in the heart of Minneapolis. So it's just, in my district, whoever whoever runs in the primary and wins the primary, they're going to be, elected if they're a Democrat. It's that's just the reality of how it is in a non-competitive district, for either party. If you don't like all their policies, keep that under wrap, right? People don't need to know that you don't like, their stance on X, Y, or Z. You want their help. Don't antagonize them. Adoption, child welfare, they tend to be bipartisan, multi-partisan things, something that all parties can agree on. So just work with them. There's nothing wrong. And there are a lot of amazing folks in both parties that are really committed, to helping families. Like, not just like, they give it lip service, but actually really care and focus on the issues. So, it's great. It's hard depending on what the policy solutions are. That can be hard, in one party or another. So I'm also going to highlight working with administrators. When advocating, be respectful. I know the administrators, the executive branch, the child protection system, sometimes it can be a challenge. Sometimes there's an adversarial relations for whatever reason, but be respectful with them. Don't burn those bridges. State staff can be crucial allies in providing information or data for you to help, um, help make the case. They may want the same outcome as you, but they can't advocate for it. Like the fix that we want in Minnesota to our alternate rate, the state definitely wants that to go away. It's not in their budget priorities set by the governor or their commissioner. And so they're not leading on it. But whenever we bring it up, it's like, yep, go for it. They're like 100% behind it. It's just not something that's their lead priority. And there are times they may not be able to advocate at all, for it. Um, but if they don't advocate for it but aren't standing in the way, that's that's good too. As I said before, they may be able to provide you with data to help make your case. If legislation gets passed, they will be involved with administering it. Things take time to implement. So you might have some opportunity if there's some flexibility with legislation on how that gets shaped and how that gets done. There may be change to rules or administrative code or policy that doesn't require the legislature. Um, and if they do, they may have email lists about rule changes and the ability for public comment, often in writing. The only state that I do that with is Ohio. I don't remember when I got on the list, and there's a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with me, um, in the work I do. But I do get those emails, and I can provide public comment there. All right, so that's a fair bit there. So talking points and telling stories, right? Like, I think that it's really important to have the data. There's going to be people that are very data driven. They're the bean counters of the world. They're going to want to know, like, what is this going to cost? How is this going to work? What is the federal reimbursement rate for us? Um, etc. But there's also people that you need to put a face or a family to the story, to like how the benefits help or how the cuts are hurting, or things like that. It just the folks sometimes work a little better with that information. So some of the talking points, and you'll get these slides. Families face special challenges raising adopted children with special needs. Currently, 113,000 foster children in the US are waiting for an adoptive family. Adoption assistance, is a critically important tool to encourage the adoption of these children and youth who have special needs. Many foster children waiting for adoption, the children already adopted from foster care have special physical, mental health, and developmental needs. study shows that these children are at heightened risk of moderate to severe health problems, learning disabilities, developmental delays, physical impairments, and mental health difficulties. I mean, we all probably know this, but sometimes it's really useful to highlight this. Um, this is, I don't remember what this is from, but there was a survey, I think it's probably about 20 years old, maybe it was hitting the mark. But adopting families reported that 50% of their children needed specialized health care. 68% had an educational delay, 69% exhibited misconduct, and 83% exhibited some other kind of serious behavioral problem. Um, I mean, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of extra support that family needs, and a lot of extra work that they provide to their child so that they can try and heal and um, get better. I mean, it's hard. Um, and I'm not going to just read all of these, so I'll just, we know this: children adopted from foster care face many more challenges than healthy birth children. The loss and grief, being removed from the first family, um, you know, maybe multiple moves, hard time forming attachment. There might have been trauma or abuse in the or neglect in the first family that are going to take a while to heal. There could be um, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that can, impacts the brain development. Just a lot of different things. Um, yeah, it's pretty much the same. You'll get these slides. Um, so that's talking about the struggles. We also can talk about the benefits. And adoptive families provide love and emotional security for their children, the stability of a committed family who will be there for them throughout childhood and into adulthood, a place to call home, and financial support. Like other parents who provide on average 38,000 in assistance to their children between ages 18 and 34, adoptive parents continue to provide support for their children as they transition into adulthood, support that's not likely available to youth who do not leave foster care for permanent families. I mean, think about that. I still get some help from my family, from my parents, and I'm over 50, I'm not going to be, all, it sometimes things just happen and they're there for me. And I try to be there for them too. Make it a two-way street. But like think about it, if a kid ages out of the system, they may not have someone to call when they have a success or when they're struggling and they need just a shoulder to cry on. They might not have someone to be with them to celebrate their first child or getting married. These are things that permanency provides beyond that financial support, which is also very important too. Um, this is from Chapin Hall. They did a study about kids aging out of the system, and it's demonstrated that youth who are adopted, when compared to youth in foster care, are more likely to complete high school or the equivalent, more likely to attend and complete college, less likely to become teen parents, less likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, less likely to have mental health problems, less likely to be arrested or incarcerated, more likely to be employed, and more likely to have adequate incomes, with one study showing that individuals adopted from foster care have incomes that are 75% higher than young adults who age out of foster care. That's pretty huge. Now, this doesn't mean, there are kids who age out that, are doing great, um, doing fine, struggling. Same with kids who have been adopted. It's going to depend on the individual, but this was a comprehensive study. And it just is showing the trends, the differences between permanency and aging out. So telling personal stories is really important. We're going to do a little video. I will, it always gets me, but I think it's a really good video out of Ontario. But the key component of any advocacy strategy is finding personal stories that demonstrate the importance of the change you seek. They lend credibility to a problem or solution. They put a human face to it. They help others identify with it, engage the reader's heart, and move people to action. So, like, and it doesn't always have to be your own story. It's more powerful if it's your own story. When I've testified, I'll tell you my two testifying stories. Um, but it's kind of funny. Um, I gave examples, but I've been doing this for 27 years, or at the time, the last time I've been doing it for 16 years. So it's been a while since I've testified. Um, when we do tell stories with adoption assistance advocacy, earlier on I said the misconception families are in it for the money. This People have that perception. So your story should demonstrate how the monthly benefit or medical insurance made a difference to the child or youth. For example, if the family couldn't have adopted without adoption assistance, the story might explore how adoption has changed the youth's behavior and is leading toward a brighter future. Or the story might discuss how the family used the adoption assistance to help the child function better in school, at home, or in the community. Be careful not to focus on the money itself or talk about things that might be considered luxuries, right? Because I mean, I've had people say, "Oh, I wish I had that. My children didn't qualify. I would have saved up for their college." You can do that. That's totally fine. That is not a compelling story that I am going to share because it just, because people are like, well, why am I not getting that from my birth child? You know, you really want to focus on how that's helping there. And one of the things you can also talk about is like the other assistance programs that drop off. Maybe you're no longer getting childcare support. Maybe, you were getting help from the case manager, the foster care manager, taking child to appointments so you could work more hours. Now you're going to have to cut back hours to meet the child's needs. Tutoring, you may have to pay out of pocket. A lot of times, other programs that support children adopted often exclude tutoring in there, trying to put that burden back on the schools to meet the educational needs. And that's a big thing. There's a lot of stuff where they're trying to do they're trying a lot of government, just like insurance and some private businesses and stuff, play a game of what I call not it. It's sort of like, oh, that's not adoption assistance, that's this program. And the other programs say, oh, no, you need to talk to that program about it. It's a common thing. The fundings have rules about what they can be used for and what they can't. And there's something else that should be doing it. It'd be better if there was a little more flexibility out there, but that's flexibility and bureaucracy are probably oxymorons if you said flexible bureaucracy. So before I do the video, I'm going to just tell you real quick the two things I did in Minnesota to testify. So the first one was for a state adoption credit. Um, and I had everything written up well. I had my research. I'd been helping with the federal adoption tax credit for like 3, 4, 5 years. I knew how tax credits worked, how they impacted families. This would make it a refundable credit in Minnesota. Awesome. And I had it all written up really well to submit to the committee when I testified. The legislator wanted me to testify on their behalf. The other one, I just went up, I got signed up and was able to do 2 minutes. But this was the legislator had a bill they wanted me to speak and testify on behalf of. And it's in the documentation. But when I got there, I was a little nervous. I read it and I sounded like the little girl in I just sounded so wooden, like the little girl in Incredible Me Too when she first does her Mother's Day song. I just like I sounded like worse than a robot, worse than those transcribing voices that you get, Siri and all that. It was awful. The next time in 2013, when we were trying to fix our adoption subsidy, we mostly fixed it. I wasn't on behalf of any legislator there. I had like 2 minutes. I wrote up our thing, had all the details there, didn't read it at all, and I just said, in Minnesota, we have very low number of kids being adopted by their foster families. And at the time, there weren't as many kids being adopted by kin. So the kids who are being adopted by a stranger. Our disparity in rates are why this is happening. And think about this. If if this child's left their first family, they've been with a foster family, the family says we can't afford to adopt. This other family shows up, they get listed on a foreign exchange, they get matched with this family. That child has to learn a third family because our system has a financial disincentive. They have to learn a new family. They have to learn what are the rules. They have to learn what is the food. Well, how do we celebrate holidays? Is it like we did in our first family or in the foster family? Maybe, maybe not. Will they make the food that I like? You know, all those things we're doing to kids because we're not willing to invest enough money to support the families. That's what I went, and I think I had much more intention focusing that way. It was not my personal story. I just gave an example because at the time, I think less than 20%, maybe probably less than 30% of kids were being, according to AFGAR's data, were being adopted by their foster families. That's really low. There are a lot of states where it's like 80, 90%. But at that time in Minnesota, that was not the case. So I'm going to do this. It's 2 minutes, and Becky, hop in if this is not working well. I'm going to put on captions because the music's a little loud in our test, and sometimes you can't hear the kids. This is from Ontario.
It's not how many pieces of gum I chew.
This is not how many pages of homework I have every night.
This is not how many times I've broken curfew.
This is not how many times I've been late for class.
It's how many times I've changed families.
Together we have had over 63 moves to different families. That's 63 moves too many.
I couch surf, so I don't even know how many times I've moved families.
Changing families should not be like changing clothes. I was adopted at 4.
I was adopted when I was 12.
I was adopted when I was 5.
I was adopted at age 9. I was adopted at age 8 and a half.
I was adopted when I was 12.
I was adopted when I was 10.
I was adopted when I was 7.
I was adopted when I was 6.
I was one of Ontario's 80% of waiting children who was never adopted.
This is the number of new families I've had since I was adopted.
All right. Sorry. So the important things there is those are kids who have been adopted, or for unfortunately one of them not. And I think that was part of the big challenge at the end that they had there, is that the government needs to keep supporting them. And there is a lot of talk out there if the government doesn't find them a family, a permanency into adulthood. I mean, it was pretty clear they put out the demand to the government about what they need to do for their children. So hopefully that was useful. It's really really powerful, and the kids, I think, came up with it all on their own, which is awesome. So some other advocacy tools. Get the media to highlight the good stories, like National Adoption Day. You know, you can send in something to your local news, your papers. You could do a foster doll project. That's something where groups come up with plausible social histories of a child, and usually a used doll. They give them, they do follow-up calls with the legislators during the session. At the end of the session, they take the doll back. That avoids gift issues. You also can see who doesn't want to give the doll back. That's like, okay, that's someone we need to develop. We need to work with that relationship. Some people might be like, you know, they just ignored it, like, you know, we'll take their vote, but you know, they're not a hot prospect. Use social media, create a visual display to represent children in the child welfare system. The Alabama Shoe Project, they gathered 6,029 pairs of shoes and placed them on the Capitol steps, each representing a child in the foster care in Alabama. And they really put out there, lawmakers in Alabama make $134.25 a day. Prisoners to house them is 35 to 98 a day, or $35.98 a day. Foster children at the time receive between $8 to $14 a day. Another comparison that is often used is how much it costs to kennel a pet if you're away on vacation. How much does that cost? Do families who have the means and pay someone to kennel their pet pay more than the state reimburses foster families? And the foster care rate is the limit on the adoption assistance rate. It can be lower, but that's a very powerful one too. Like we don't value our state's children as much as people do their pets. This is what it looked like. I've not been to the Alabama Capitol. I've driven past it, but I've not been to the Capitol steps. I know what it looks like in Minnesota and a couple other states, but that, anybody that's been there in Alabama probably has a good sense of like, oh, wow, that's wow. If you've been someplace, the visuals has a bigger impact. Now, a project like this, you need a lot of volunteers and you need space and transportation. If you look over in the bottom left corner, there's a whole lot of boxes and they're taller than these people. So, they had to have a truck. They had to get people to get the boxes out of the truck, take them out into put them on the steps and then collect them afterwards. A lot of work, but it sometimes can be really impactful. Research, on our website, we have these three toolkits. A lot of it has some of the stuff I've talked about already. The value of adoption subsidy, the adoption assistance advocacy toolkit, and the vital role of adoption subsidies. And a lot of them have, the citations or research in them. They will be branded. It was before our name changed to Families Rising. They'll be branded under NACAC, but those are our publications. There's a lot of other information out there too. I'm not going to read you the titles of these. What's really nice is there are a couple in here by Mary Hansen, and she's with the Department of Economics at American University. So sometimes it's really useful to have it come not from a social service side of things, but an economic analysis that, investing like this makes a difference. So that's kind of nice to throw in there for the bean counter folks. Like, what is this going to mean for us? Some specific ideas for advocacy. Get the subsidy rates up to the maximum foster care rate. Like in Texas, I'm not sure what the foster care rates are, but geez, for over 15 years, except for maybe 20 kids a year, the highest rate is 545 or 400 for the basic kids. Like that's ridiculous. It's very low. The states can have a subsidy rate up to the maximum foster care rate, but they're not required to. The feds allow them to set a lower ceiling. Some states do negotiate. Some states don't. Minnesota doesn't negotiate. We have a structural problem with our alternate rate where kids who get permanency before the age of 6 get 50%. That's in our state law. We're trying to fix that, at least for some kids. But they don't have to negotiate. There's like, this is what it is. It's like, okay, I'm going to take it. Sometimes people reach out to me on their individual case and they're like, I want to try and get higher. I want to negotiate. And it's like, well, you're getting the maximum you can. So there isn't any room there. If your state already has equal rates and offers the maximum, doesn't negotiate, but the rates are very low, then advocate for the foster care and adoption subsidy rates to increase. That can be really important, and that's provinces too, not just states. Subsidy to age 21. This is a US slide. Many states do provide subsidy past the age of 18, but often with conditions. Some states use state funds to fund kids still in school. It can be high school or college, depending on the state and possibly the age the child does it. Adding this now would be hard, but the easier ones to do are the federal funds. if the child has a disability that warrants continuation of adoption subsidy to age 21, they can get federal dollars up to the age of 21. And with the passage of Fostering Connections in 2008, states were able to opt in, and some states, the only extension is for this population is youth adopted at age 16 or older if they meet certain requirements. And the youth must be completing secondary school or equivalent, enrolled in post-secondary or vocational school, participating in a program or activity that promotes or removes barriers to employment, employed 80 hours a month, or incapable of any of these because of a documented medical condition. Most states have this because they want to encourage the adoption. They don't want to have a financial disincentive for the 16 to 18-year-olds being adopted. And that's why this was added into that Fostering Connections law, is to try and take those barriers out. Adding other services. Is there a specific service in your state that needs to be added that would be nice? But the question is because that's into the knotted thing, is it supposed to be covered by other programs or a requirement of the schools? Like when people tell me speech, I'm like, you probably have to talk to the school. Or, get something from the doctor saying it's a medical need, if there's something physically wrong. How much will it cost? Who will be eligible for it? Do you have to reside in the state that the child came from foster care? Like I think Vermont and probably Missouri, they have some child care assistance that's available to families who have adopted, but they don't work if you live in another state. I know for sure Vermont doesn't. I think because of the way Missouri is structured and it's done through the Department of Education, I suspect it's not available if you reside outside of Missouri, but adopted from Missouri DSS. So there's like a lot of things there. Other things that could be fixed, like in Maryland, if the kid's receiving non-Title IV adoption assistance, they were adopted before July 1st of last year, and the parent becomes disabled and gets Social Security disability benefits and dependent benefits on behalf of their child, most states won't impact that. Minnesota actually had that in law that it would reduce our adoption subsidy. We were able to challenge that. Same with in Maryland back, 20 years ago. But Maryland with the non-4E, because it's all their dollars, still does that reduction. And I don't know if that's something that folks in Maryland ever want to take on, but I'm ready to help them if they do and highlight how Maryland's an outlier with that. Canada specific ideas. In Ontario, they have a targeted adoption subsidy program that's done by the ministry, but it has a hard income test, and families over it, they get nothing. The province of British Columbia phases out, reduces the amount available, but also it's not just straight income. The larger the family, there's a grid, family size income percentages. The other thing that'd be great in Canada is if the federal government actually provided funding to the provinces. Currently, it's all within the provinces, which makes it very hard to track Canada because there's no cohesive funding and structure like in the US under Title IV-E that keeps everything the same. So here are my two examples of two state examples. In Washington State, basically in Washington State in 2009, they started negotiating adoption support. That's what they call in Washington State, adoption support. And the legislator was starting to look at things. And they eventually said, I think maybe in 2011, hey, department, you can't go more than 80% of the foster care rates in any of your negotiations. We're having budget issues here. You can't go more than 80%. They eventually passed a law that said 80%, but for a time limit. They revisited it, and and when they did cap it at 80% in law, it was unanimous. Both houses, all Democrats. I think there was one no vote. All Democrats, all Republicans voted for this 80% cap. They've adjusted it, they've learned, and what they've done now is that the state law is to cap the rate at 80 to 95%. but it depends on the age at the time of adoption. Younger children, it's going to be up to 80%. The in-between children, probably young school age, maybe grade school, maybe middle school. It might be 90%, and then high school teenagers, it's going to be 95% is the cap on negotiation. So they've learned, they've said, yeah, the one size fits all. In the reality, and this is the same thing with Minnesota's alternate rate, they see younger children who have not had disability, have not been diagnosed often, because some things at the young age they don't want to diagnose, or things aren't really picked up upon until they're in the schools. Those young kids are easier to get adopted because there's not as much known yet about the challenges they'll face in the future. I don't think it should work that way, but that's part of why those are where they make their compromises. In Indiana, in 2009, they consolidated things from the counties to something called the Essential Eligibility Unit. It's like probably the most government named thing ever. And when they did that, there was concern, including from some legislators, that not enough money was allocated for the new program when the state created this Central Eligibility Unit. And by that fall, October or September, I was starting to hear from families that they weren't, children who were determined eligible for adoption subsidy were not getting payments if they were non-4E. They were put on a wait list because it was their dollars, just like that Maryland thing I was mentioning, it was their dollars. If they were Title 4E, they were negotiating an adoption subsidy, but for the non-4E kids, they put them on a wait list. They said, someday in the future, we may start paying you adoption subsidy, but there will be no back payment. And we don't know when that day will be. And it was really frustrating. In 2014, a grandmother who had adopted her grandchildren with just the Medicaid card, but no monthly payment because they were non-4E, she sought a class action lawsuit, and we did an affidavit in support of the lawsuit. And when we did that, the state actually settled the next day, which was really cool. And they started to fund it. Now, they originally funded just 1 year, about $10 million. So that's a lot of money to fund all those kids who had not been funded in the last 5 years. It also funded some of the kids who were getting the extension past the age of 18, but it was based on their education, still being in school. Some of those kids were in that wait list. They were getting the extension with the Medicaid, but not the per diem had ended. They did make it permanent the following year and funded it. The problem is, if they fund it and they don't add more money, it's going to make the negotiations more challenging for both the 4E and non-4E programs. Now, parents worked for years to advocate for that the minimum negotiation the state offers was 50% of the foster care per diem, that it couldn't be lower than that. And that took effect eventually in two parts. I actually did testify on that in 2019, but it took a couple of years for it to pass. At first, it was just for therapeutic high need kids. Then later it was for all kids. What was really cool is they've always had one of the lowest ages for qualifying, age 2. That, any kid 2 or older is considered special needs, hard to place. They're qualifying for adoption subsidy. Illinois is at age 1 is the only one based on age that is lower. There are a lot of states where essentially every kid qualifies, but to actually codify it and say it's all ages, they put that in legislation last year and it passed. And so as of last year, I think July 1st, all ages qualified. And I had some conversations last year with them. They were looking at different ways to negotiate. They have at this point, they were down to 6 negotiators. And the first comment to them is like, have you ever thought of just giving them the foster care rate? And they're like, well, we thought about it. They ended up doing that last year. It's not always a bad idea to throw out the crazy pie in the sky thing, because sometimes they do it. So as of July 1st for new adoptions, I'm not sure about the renegotiation for existing agreements prior to July 1st, but all the new adoptions as of July 1st last year, they don't have to negotiate. They're just offered the foster care rate, which is awesome because it's been a challenge for families there. For folks who want data, you can always reach out to me. But AFCARS collects a lot of information, like age at finalization, child, are they adopted by foster, kin, married couples, single, men, single women. There's just all sorts of information out there. If anybody's looking to really do any advocacy in their state, please reach out to me. I would love to help you any way I can, because partly that's my job, but I know what's going on out there, and we can try and highlight what other states are doing. So I just went through a lot. And I'm not sure if Miss Cates from Tennessee, if you were the one that asked why there's annual renewal, someone from Tennessee in the notes mentioned, and there are any other questions you have, why states do annual renewals? They're not required to, but a lot of times states do annual renewals, or every couple of year renewals, just to keep track of where the family is and to document that they're legally and financially responsible. For families who get stuff like that, it's usually going to be just sort of documenting, going after probably fraud, that they're not legally responsible or they're not financially supporting the child. So, questions, Becky? Did you see any?
There's not any questions now, but yeah, folks, if you have questions later, you can just follow up with Josh. And Josh, thanks for all of this. That was a lot.
Yep. Well, I thank everybody for participating. Hopefully there was useful information there. And as I said earlier, if you have specific stuff that you need for your family or families you're serving, please reach out to me and I'll help you with that too. But if you're trying to do advocacy change in your state, around adoption assistance, or adoption tax credit, I would love to talk with you and help you any way I can.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Becky.
Yeah.